All right, let's just dive right into this. Today, we're tackling a wildly ambitious goal. We are going to cover roughly 400 years of dense, complicated history to try and understand the entire story of the United States of America. We'll break it down into clear, evolutionary eras. It is an absolutely amazing journey of how a modern giant was born, so let's get started. To act as a sort of roadmap for us, we're chunking this massive story into 5 distinct chapters: Collision of Worlds, The Road to Independence, Forging a New Government, Expansion and Manifest Destiny, and finally, A House Divided and Rebuilt. Starting right off with Chapter 1, Collision of Worlds. Way before we ever had 50 states, the North American continent was home to incredibly sophisticated Native American societies that had thrived for thousands of years. But when those ancient communities collided with eager European explorers looking for new resources, the continent's settlement happened lightning fast. Just look at this timeline. In 1492, Columbus arrives. By 1564, the Spanish set up St. Augustine, which is the first permanent settlement. In 1607, the English finally get a foothold in Jamestown. And then we hit 1619, which is a massive pivot point. This marks the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia, introducing chattel slavery at the exact same time the colonies are just taking root. And then literally a year later, in 1620, the Puritans arrive seeking religious freedom and sign the Mayflower Compact. Now, this early era was really defined by some wildly different perspectives on what land and value even meant. $24. That's the legendary equivalent amount that the Dutch West India Company actually paid the Munsee Lenape tribe back in 1624 to purchase the entire island of Manhattan just to build New Amsterdam. Of course, early colonial life wasn't exactly a walk in the park. It was defined by some truly harsh realities. First contact introduced catastrophic European diseases that absolutely decimated native populations. And the constant tension over land sparked brutal violence, like King Philip's War in 1675, which was the bloodiest conflict in North America up to that point. Meanwhile, all these massive European power struggles just kept spilling over into the colonies. And underpinning all of this rapid economic growth was the triangle trade. It was a growing, frankly grotesque reliance on buying and selling human lives across the Atlantic. That brings us to Chapter 2, The Road to Independence. So, as we push into the 18th century, the colonies experience this massive population boom. We're talking going from roughly 250,000 people to over 1 million. But global warfare was about to shift their loyalties forever. Up to 1.4 million, that is the staggering estimated casualty count of the 7 Years' War, which played out over here as the French and Indian War. Great Britain wins, they secure vast new territories, but they are left with monumental war debts. So, desperate to pay off the tab, the British Parliament turns their eyes toward taxing the rapidly growing American colonies. The British Parliament essentially passes a sequence of acts to raise revenue, completely without consulting the colonies. From the Sugar Act to the Stamp Acts and then the Townshend Acts, colonial pushback escalates from just boycotting goods to outright violence. By 1770, tensions boil over into the lethal Boston Massacre. In 1773, they famously dump a massive cargo of tea into the harbor. And ultimately, by 1775, out on the town green of Lexington, the very first shots are fired. Resentment had officially transformed into an armed revolution. But here is the fascinating thing. The core ideology driving all this anger really wasn't the exorbitant costs. The taxes themselves were actually pretty low. The heart of the issue was the fundamental lack of consultation. The colonists believed that as British subjects, they had natural rights that were being completely violated by a distant parliament. No taxation without representation wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was the rallying cry of a people who felt their constitutional rights were being ripped away. Moving right along to Chapter 3, Forging a New Government. After an incredibly arduous and bloody war, and with some major help from the French, the colonies pull it off. They achieve independence. But the newly independent states quickly realized their first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was a total bust. It couldn't manage debt, it couldn't regulate trade, it was just too weak. So in 1787, they huddle up at the Constitutional Convention to figure out a completely new design. What they came up with is brilliant. They structured a new government divided into 3 distinct branches. The legislative branch creates the laws, the executive enforces them, and the judicial interprets them. It was this intentional, giant puzzle of checks and balances designed to make absolutely sure no single body or person could ever hold absolute power like the king they just fought so hard to overthrow. But as you can probably guess, getting everyone to agree on this new constitution wasn't easy. And it actually births the first American political factions. On one side, you have the Federalists. They championed the new Constitution and really wanted a powerful central government. On the other side, the Anti-Federalists. They feared this new structure was going to trample right over states' rights and local control. And honestly, that exact debate, federal power versus state and local sovereignty, became a permanent hallmark of American politics. We are quite literally still arguing about it today. In the early days of the Republic, those first presidents set some absolutely massive precedents. George Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, basically ensuring the presidency wouldn't just become a new monarchy. Thomas Jefferson effectively doubled the size of the entire nation overnight by buying the Louisiana Territory in 1803. And then, surviving the War of 1812 against the British Empire really proved to the globe that this young nation was a permanent, sovereign fixture on the world stage. Tragically, though, that exact war definitively crushed any remaining hopes for a sovereign Native American territory. Which brings us to Chapter 4, Expansion and Manifest Destiny. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. is experiencing explosive growth, fueled by this ravenous desire to stretch its borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And that drive, it was fueled by an idea called manifest destiny. This was the deeply held 19th century belief that the United States was unquestionably destined to stretch from sea to shining sea. It wasn't just some political goal, it was viewed as a divine right. And it pushed hundreds of thousands of settlers out west, completely disregarding the Native American tribes and Mexican territories that were already living on those vast lands. And if you want to know what acted as the ultimate economic magnet for this rush, $170 billion. That is the staggering estimated modern equivalent value of the gold mined during the California Gold Rush. When they discovered gold in 1848, population numbers in places like San Francisco literally skyrocketed overnight. It drew prospectors from all over the globe and turned remote little outposts into booming hubs of commerce. But we absolutely have to talk about the human cost of this rapid expansion because it was devastating. The 1830 Indian Removal Act forcibly displaced 60,000 Native Americans, leading directly to the Trail of Tears, where roughly 15,000 people died. The Mexican-American War forcibly added over 1 million square miles of territory to the U.S., and right alongside all this physical expansion, the fierce struggle over whether these brand new territories would allow slavery intensified. That very tension is what led brave abolitionists like Harriet Tubman to risk absolutely everything, rescuing more than 70 enslaved people via the Underground Railroad. And that boiling tension leads us right into Chapter 5, A House Divided and Rebuilt. After Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, the incredibly fragile balance between slave states and free states finally just shatters, plunging the whole nation into a brutal war. And it was a war of immense mismatches. The North held massive advantages in industry, sheer manpower, and naval power, and initially they were just fighting to preserve the Union. The South, on the other hand, fighting for secession and to preserve slavery, couldn't match the North's resources. They desperately needed swift battlefield victories and really just hoped, in vain as it turns out, that Europe would intervene and save them. To press their massive advantage, the North rolled out what they called the Anaconda Plan. It was exactly what it sounds like. General Winfield Scott's strategy was to implement a full-scale naval blockade of the South, literally choking off the resources they needed to run the war. Later on, Union Generals Grant and Sherman combined this with devastating total war tactics on the ground, destroying infrastructure, burning crops, basically aiming to completely crush the Confederacy's physical and psychological ability to even fight. We really need to pause for a second to try and comprehend this staggering number, 600,000. That is the astronomical human toll of the American Civil War. 600,000 lives lost before Confederate General Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. Yes, the country was preserved, but it came at an almost unimaginable cost to an entire generation of Americans. Out of the ashes of all that destruction came Reconstruction, which brought some truly monumental steps forward. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th guaranteed voting rights. These were massive, incredible expansions of civil rights. However, we have to note that federal enforcement of these rights was tragically abandoned due to a political compromise in 1877. They pulled the troops out of the South, which unfortunately paved the way for the systemic disenfranchisement of the Jim Crow era. Looking back, this whole ongoing struggle really brings us back to those famous foundational words penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. When you look at the macro level of the American story, the overarching theme is this continuous and often violent struggle over exactly who gets included in that sentence, who gets representation, who actually gets those unalienable rights. It's an evolving journey that certainly didn't end in the 1800s. From the very early collision of worlds through a devastating civil war, rapid westward expansion, and profound industrial growth, the United States has transformed into an undeniable economic and military powerhouse. People even call it the modern Roman Empire. But after exploring roughly 400 years of incredibly dense, turbulent history, it leaves us with a really provocative question. Can this giant continue its dominance? The history of the U.S. shows this remarkable, continuous ability to reinvent itself. But the future? Well, that's always unwritten. So what do you think the next chapter holds? Thanks so much for exploring this massive story with me. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.